everything that happens in this courthouse, at least everything that happens with the jury in the room, it's really about essentially one thing. And that's a search for the truth. And normally, in guilt phase type proceedings, it's a very simple concept. What did the person do? What do the facts establish? And what's the law? And you make an application of those two together and decide, hey, did the state meet their burden or the state didn't meet their burden? And then ultimately you can decide, is he guilty or not guilty? The unique exception of a penalty phase is that it's not just a truth-finding function. And there is one, and we'll talk about what that truth is. But there's also something else. We allow the jury to decide sort of what matters. Does something matter or not? Should we consider a particular piece of evidence, even if we find that evidence to be true? And that's the concept in this particular case, right? Mitigators in general, you get to decide, does it really mitigate his punishment or not? But the question sort of that's been presented in this case is one where you have to ask yourself, the 31 years, does it matter or not? And whichever one you choose to go with, does it mitigate his crime or not mitigate his crime, you still have to answer that first essential question. You know, they say that justice delayed is justice denied. Why do they say that? Because you get punished for what you did, not who you've become. And so in this case, there's really no way to give a full measured amount of justice because it has been 31 years. But why do we say it's been justice delayed is justice denied? We would care if Mother Teresa committed a crime. That would mitigate her sentence. But we as a society expect that once you've committed your crime, you don't get to go back and make amends for your punishment. Your actions afterwards are what you're supposed to be doing. And despite the fact it took him 15 years to stop committing the infractions, he doesn't get 15 years of freebies. That doesn't increase the sentence, not reduce it. And the other thing when we talk about should we or should we not consider it, what you need to start with is a concept of motive. Motive is complex. People don't do things on a routine basis for a single reason. So in their world, in this case, John Valerio stopped committing offenses at age 36, 37, whenever it was, because he suddenly became a good person. Really? We heard Richard Hancher say, well, yeah, almost all our prisoners age out. Do we really think the Department of Corrections is working so well that our prisons are rehabilitation all of our prisoners? Because all of our prisoners are aging out. They stop making violations. Okay. Well, what about, I just became a good person? What about the fact that, you know, hey, look, you know someday a guy like me is going to be standing up here talking about it. So, is that a reason for you to stop? And the answer from Dr. Reutman is this. He couldn't control himself. That's his answer. He should have continued to commit violations. But why the heck isn't everybody else who's aged out in the prison system continuing to commit violations? What about Mr. Valerio is unique? You heard Sherman Hatcher say it. The guys that are housed in a specialized unit like Mr. Valerio, they behave the same way they do. Infractions, infractions, infractions until they finally figure out the hole's a bad thing. That deprivation is a bad thing. So the question you have to ask yourself is, even if it matters, are you willing to accept the word of John Valerio that he's changed? Because what does Dr. Reutman really say? Well, I talked to John Valerio, and because he hasn't had a violation, it must be true. I mean, if you were going to see Dr. Reutman for a medical diagnosis, you'd sue him for malpractice for not looking into any of the evidence that underlies this case. Because he starts with a basic premise in this case, which is the actions of John Valerio are always impulsive. He can't help himself but to commit this crime. He can't help himself for all the other choices he's made because he can't control the urges in himself. And we know that if that were true, he wouldn't continue to commit violations. Really? What about any of this evidence is impulsive? Now, there's another thing you should learn, and I should have said this before I started, about the truth, which is, don't ever rely upon what lawyers say. I just sat here and listened to both Mr. Pesci and Mr. Pitaro. I was in the same room you were. And Mr. Pitaro spent a whole bunch of time saying, Mr. Pesci just said to you 20 minutes before that John Valerio was definitely going to be paroled. Did you hear that come out of Mr. Pesci's mouth? No. What Mr. Pesci said is he'd be 11 years late for his parole hearing. He didn't say he was going to get paroled. The other thing Mr. Pitaro said, oh, Sherman Hatcher said there's very few people who come back to prison after serving 30 years. Ooh, that's not what Sherman Hatcher said. Sherman Hatcher said about 50-50 come back. Then after he realized, he just said that half the people that get released on parole after 30 years of prison come back to prison. Then he started qualifying. Well, yeah, a lot of them are for violations of their parole agreements and when they go back into custody, and I'm not aware of a whole lot of people who've committed violent crimes. That gets muted by Mr. Pitaro to very few people ever go back to prison after getting parole. So when you talk about the truth-finding function, no matter what I say, no matter what they say, the truth-finding function of a jury is not based upon what you hear, it's what you read. It's what you see from the witness stand. And you are going to, at some point, have to make this determination. You're going to have to figure out the truth of just this one question. Who is the true John Valerio? Is he John Newton? Or is he the person who did what he did to Karen Blackwell? Do you feel comfortable knowing the answer to that question? Do you feel comfortable that John Valerio has suddenly found in life redemption because he said it? Everybody knows the story of Amazing Grace. Everybody knows that a prisoner says, hey, I've changed, I've learned from my mistakes. And apparently if you're Dr. Royman, that means there's nothing wrong with you and you'll never commit a crime again. But let's go actually to what the evidence is. There was a mention of the parole board. And, you know, they have all these great records and they know what they're doing. The suggestion to you, and I think I heard him say, Mr. Pitaro said something about life with the possibility is trite. It seems trite. It seems ridiculous. If you're on your third felony conviction, you get the minimum possible sentence, right? I mean, don't we reserve the minimum possible sentence for those people in this world who made a mistake in their life? Not the guy who's on his third strike. There's a reason there's 3 strikes and you're out. He committed 3 violent offenses before this murder. And you say, I deserve the minimum possible sentence. He suggested that Mr. Pesci and I reject the idea that someone can change. God, I hope so. I'm a prosecutor. I hope people can change. I send people to prison in the hopes that there's going to be rehabilitation. But I'm also a realist. For all the John Newtons in the world, there are 10,000 John Valerios, maybe 1 million John Valerios. Somebody who there is 0 evidence of his actual change. I mean, look, you heard that there's some woman named Katie Stevens who apparently finds a prisoner online and has communications with Mr. Valerio. And that person is important in his life. Except for when you hear about Dr. Reitman, who talked to him on 3 occasions. I never heard about Katie. There was some Elaine for the last 25 years that he's been friends with. But who the hell's Elaine? What is it that you know about John Valerio? Well, you know the one thing is that at least in 1986, he enjoyed pain. He enjoyed infliction of pain. And while this isn't a truth-finding function about what did or didn't happen in 1986 from a standpoint of is he guilty, you certainly have to take the evidence as a whole to decide who John Valerio is. In the 80s, even before that, the 70s, I know Mr. Pitaro has cited John Newton. I'm going to suggest to you there's Billy Joel. Billy Joel wrote a song. It's called The Stranger. And he's talking about something that we all understand and none of us really think about. There's the person we present to the real world, and then there's that person that's in the deep thoughts of our mind. The true person that you are, the true you. And Mr. Joel asks a question in one of his songs, did you ever let your lover see the stranger in yourself? The question being, do you have anybody in your life that knows the true you? And that's the question as we sit here today. Is John Valerio the person that he's portraying in his statement to you, the unsworn statement to you, yesterday or Friday or whatever day it was? Or is he the person that Karen Blackwell met? And in order to know that, you have to know the evidence. So think about who John Valerio is on September 19th of 1986. First, you know he's on bail from an attack upon a woman named Angela Howard. And what does Angela tell you? She says, yeah, he puts the gun in my face, but once I realize he's in the car, that it's going to be a robbery, he tells me he just wants my money, I tell him, fine, I'm going to go get my money. And she bends over to get the money. It's at that point he calls her, he says, you bitch, and he hits her over the head, and the gun discharges, which clearly scares him off, and he jumps out of the car and runs. What is it that he really was planning on doing with Angela Howard? What did he learn? Because he learned a little bit from his first crime against Mr. Henderson, right? He pushed him down, stole his wallet in a casino. Oh, that's a bad idea, so what is it this time? This time he's hiding behind at a restaurant, waiting for his prey to come to him, and he learns a lesson, which is, hey, it is really hard to kidnap somebody. It is really hard for a stranger kidnap, even if you hide out behind a restaurant and a woman by herself is getting into her car. Things can go wrong. So what do you know now? 30 days later, he wants to do what he wants to do. And you ask yourself, does this make sense? Well, yeah, he learned again. And to be honest with you, he just got really unlucky because he probably shouldn't have ever been caught. What do you know, and we didn't talk about this, but it's all in there in the transcripts, because there's a truth-finding function. You should go back there and read those transcripts. You'll know that Karen Blackwell is an out-of-work nursing assistant who couldn't find a job, but she had a little girl that she had to make money to support. And while the choice wasn't the best choice in her life, she chose to be a prostitute. And you learned from that she placed ads, and from those ads she had numbers and names, and from that you could figure out who she was, Roxanne, and the phone number, and the cops were able to verify that information. But the one thing you also know is she did something highly unusual, and the only thing that ever allowed the police to figure out it was John Valerio. She wrote down the names of her Johns, and then starred the ones she went to and put their addresses. And had she not talked to her boyfriend, Barry Kozlov, that night and say she was in the area of Tropical Paradise and she was going back to that same area, had that little fact and that book not exist, John Valerio never gets caught for this crime. It is a sophisticated crime, and what you know about it is something else. It is highly premeditated. Why? One, you know about his behavior beforehand, where first he did it in the casino, then he tried to attack a woman out in the street, and that didn't go well. Now he brought her to him in a confined area, and what do you know did he have? He had to have a blunt instrument, and I'm going to suggest to you, you know he has a gun, because it's found in the washer. He has the ability to use that weapon just for a robbery. He has that ability to use that weapon if he just wanted to kill her. But that's not just what he wants. He's got an orange zip tie. Why does he have an orange zip tie? What does he intend to do? He needs it for what? It's not a ligature. He needs it for control. He has to control this woman for what he's going to do for her. And they made a lot of fun of Detective Vaccaro looking at photographs. Trust me, crime scene reconstruction is not rocket science. You know, gravity is gravity. Things go up, they come down. When blood is flying through the air, it goes in directions. But you can look at that crime scene, you could stand there and you can imagine some things that are absolutely beyond a doubt, which is as she's disrobing, he hits her over the head with that blunt object. And as she goes down on her knees, dazed and everything else, he gets control of her by putting the orange zip tie around her. And I agree with John Valerio. When you're on your knees, you begin to pray. And I bet you that's what Karen Blackwell did. And as he has her now in control, how do you know that this wasn't a swift attack? As Mr. Erickson, I think, said to you, Dr. Coates says this was like a blitzkrieg attack. Dr. Coates never said that. They asked him about, in times, have you seen where there's an act of rage? And he says yes, but they never asked him, in this case, do you have an opinion as to whether or not? Because how could he possibly have that opinion? This isn't rocket science. You don't need to be a medical doctor to know certain things. Do you remember Dr. Hollander said, I don't think that's the knife, because if that's the knife, there'd be hilt marks. And then she explained what hilt marks are. It's when the knife hits into the skin, it makes a mark for where the hilt of the knife is. What else did she say? Well, when you're hit in the head, I imagine it had to have come first, because I can't imagine someone would sit still for all those wounds. Well, what is she saying? This woman has 45 stab wounds, and her hands are cut twice. She's got a cut in the arm 3 times. 45 times a knife's coming at her. She's defending during this? No, she's not. She's being controlled. Look at the knife wounds themselves. There wasn't a great amount of force used, according to the defense. Absolutely. That's exactly the point. If this was a blitzkrieg attack, you'd see things hitting the bone. You'd see the hilt marks from the knife going in. No, you don't see any of that. What happens if you were to get a knife stuck in your neck? What would your initial reaction to be? It'd be to pull away. It'd be to rip it away. You'd have cuts and slashes. You'd have hilt marks from the knife going in if this was a... No, this is slow. It's painful. And it takes a long time. And why is it so slow? Why is he over her, controlling her, slowly sticking a knife in and out of her neck? Why is she unable to stop it from happening? And you heard from Dr. Coates and Dr. Hollander. This isn't a quick death for Karen Blackwell. Her lungs are filling up with blood as she can't breathe. Her liver is bleeding into her stomach. She gets a knife wound that causes her to lose control of her body function from her neck down. Mr. Pesci talked about the thoughts of Karen Blackwell between the time of stab number 1 and stab 45, but looking at this crime scene, that isn't like 45 stab wounds like this. Mr. Valerio took the time to slide a knife into another human being 45 times. What does that suggest to you about what he was doing? Impulse? That's an impulsive behavior? No, that's not impulse. That's just downright evil. And the one thing Dr. Roykin could agree with me is that the underlying character of a human being does not change. Evil does not change. And to suggest to you that you should get an opportunity for parole because you can recite, I don't think about the enjoyment of pain on another human being. The only person in this world, well, maybe 2 people, I would suggest to you, Angela Howell got introduced to the true John Valerio, but she didn't stick around long enough to really see the true him. And when Mr. Valerio says in his unsworn statement that he thinks about, quote, what happened to Karen Blackwell, like it was some sort of accident that occurred as he was drunk driving and he didn't mean to kill her. No. He might be thinking about what happened to her because she's the only woman in this world who's ever met the true John Valerio. He hasn't had access to another woman for the rest of his life. Not one that he could truly introduce to himself. And that's not an impulse he's had to control for the last 30 years. That's the true John Valerio. That's the person you're sentencing for a crime. Mr. Pitaro said, if you issue a verdict of death, it means I want you dead. If you issue a verdict of life without, I want you to rot in prison. Nobody wants to be here. Nobody wants to have to do what you do in this life, but you took an oath to do justice. It's not I want it, it is justice. But if you issue this individual the possibility of parole, you will be saying, I am comfortable meeting John Valerio on the street. That is something I'd be willing to accept the possibility of.
Objection, I object to the phrase that they want to meet him on the street, or that's what the verdict is going to say. So
All right,
I would strike that.
I will strike that last sentence and order the jury to disregard.
I will suggest to you that the possibility of parole means the possibility he gets to meet another Karen Blackwell. And are you willing to accept that possibility? In any sentence you give here, and this shouldn't be about Mr. Pesci and I arguing about death and them arguing for life with, and thus you should come to life without. In any sentence you give here, you are defining justice. And whatever sentence you come back with, Mr. Pesci and I, we're going to respect it. Because that's the system we live in which we let 12 people decide what should happen here. But the question you have to ask yourself before you sign the verdict form is this. No matter which way it goes, whether you find the aggravators outweigh the mitigators or the mitigators outweigh the aggravators, before that poor person signs that verdict form, ask yourself, am I doing justice? Justice. Equal and exact justice. And somebody who had no criminal history did that to Karen Blackwell. That person wouldn't get life with the possibility of parole because you cannot take that risk. You cannot accept the possibility that he may meet another woman on the street. I suggest to you, as Mr. Pesci did, that the sentence he deserved in 1988 is no different than the sentence that he deserves today. Because we should be sentencing him for who he was. And there's zero evidence that he has changed. Zero. I suggest to you he deserves the maximum punishment. Not that we want it. Not that any person would want to have to impose it, but you took an oath to do justice. And God knows that sentence that we are asking for, it's time. It's right. It's just. And it's just time. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel.